My name is K.T. McFarland, and I knew President Reagan because I was in the Reagan administration as the speechwriter and spokesman at the Pentagon. I was in charge of the communications department at the Pentagon, so I would do everything from write speeches to oversee congressional testimony of the Secretary of Defense. But my real interaction with President Reagan was when he gave speeches about defense issues. So I would often write the first draft of a lot of the speeches he gave, including my great claim to fame was the Star Wars speech. I wrote the speech. I wrote all these great words that nobody remembers because the only thing anybody remembers from that speech is the 2 paragraphs Ronald Reagan wrote himself, which was calling on the scientists and the engineering and innovative communities in the United States to develop a missile shield. But when he gave the speech the very next day, the New York Post had a headline that says, Star Wars planned to zap red nukes. So the way people referred to it ever after was a Star Wars initiative. And the great thing about that was ultimately that's how we won the Cold War. When I first went to work at the Pentagon at the beginning of the Reagan administration, President Reagan had the Secretary of Defense into the Oval Office. And President Reagan said to Cap Weinberger, my boss, why are these military guys not in their uniforms? We were informed that because after the Vietnam War and the anti-military attitude in the country, the military were not allowed to wear their uniforms, that it was too provocative, too militaristic. So the first thing Reagan did was say, everybody back in their uniforms. So the Secretary of Defense put a decree out that if you're going to work at the Pentagon and you're in the military, we want to see you in your uniform. The problem was the military hadn't worn their uniforms in 5 or 6 years. They didn't fit. So they'd all of a sudden you would see people jogging across Memorial Bridge, going from the Pentagon to the Lincoln Memorial and back, trying to get fit so that they could fit into their uniforms. And so President Reagan, as part of his defense buildup, wanted to send a signal to the men and women in uniform. Now, the first thing he did was to give them a pay raise because the most junior enlisted men and women, their pay was so low that they qualified for food stamps. Reagan changed all that, but to make a symbol to how much the President of the United States, President Reagan, would honor the service of the military, he asked Cap Weinberger, there's got to be somebody we can give an award to. Instead of a posthumous award, there's got to be some person we've given an award to which we haven't had a presentation by the President. So sure enough, we found a Sergeant, Benavides, and President Reagan came to the Pentagon on a beautiful sunny day and in the courtyard of the Pentagon, gave the award and pinned it on its shoulder. And as a result, the military understood this is a president who believes in us, who's going to give us the things that we need, the resources we need to do our job, and is going to honor us. I was not in the car when this happened, but a good friend of mine, Ed Rollins, who was President Reagan's political director, told me this story, and I don't think it's been written anywhere. But President Reagan gave a speech at Arlington Memorial Cemetery in the morning. It was Memorial Day. And in the United States in the late 1970s, the one topic nobody would discuss, no political leader would never discuss Vietnam. It was like the third rail because you couldn't win to talk about it. Reagan understood that, but he wanted to honor the people who served, regardless of the outcome of that war. And so he went to Arlington Cemetery on Memorial Day, and he thanked them for their service. And he talked about Vietnam. And I'm looking around seeing these men, mostly men in uniform, some were in wheelchairs, some looked like they were sleeping rough on the streets, and they were crying. Some of them had their battle medals, pinned to their khaki or their t-shirts. And Reagan honored them for their service. So I was at my office at Fox News telling this story to my friend Ed Rollins, and he said, do you know what happened after that speech? He said, you said goodbye to President Reagan. He got on the plane and he went to Colorado Springs to the Air Force Academy. And he gave the commencement address at the Air Force Academy. It was one of the first years that women had graduated. And President Reagan gave the first salute to 1,000 young men and women from the Air Force Academy. So then President Reagan gets in the car and is on his way to California. And I think he was with Mike Deaver and he was with Ed Rollins. And so Ed reaches over to the president and he says, President Reagan, that was such a remarkable thing you did. You gave the first salute to those 1,000 graduates of the Air Force Academy. They'll remember that for the rest of their lives, because the first salute any officer gets is a momentous moment for him. But to get it from the President of the United States, your Commander-in-Chief, is even more important. And then President Reagan said to Ed Rollins, he said, "Ed, I didn't do it for them. I did it for me, because I wanted to look in their eyes, every single one of them. I didn't want to see them as statistics and numbers, because I wanted to know that if I have to send them into battle and into conflict, and I will not hesitate if I have to, but I wanted to know them as people, as individuals." To me, that was the perfect example of Ronald Reagan. He honored the men and women who had fought in the Vietnam War at Arlington Cemetery in the morning, and then in the afternoon, he flew across the country and talked about the future of the country and future leaders, and he talked to the next generation of officers.